Lisa raised her glass in the middle of a wedding I had paid $500,000 for. Then she smiled and said to the 400 guests in the room, "Victoria is very lucky. A woman who can't even read a menu still gets to sit at the head table." A quiet wave of laughter moved through the room. My son said nothing. My wife just stood there, holding a small check in her hand, looking down at it as if she were trying to read something written on the paper. They thought she was slow. They thought she didn't understand what was happening. What they didn't know, that little check in her hand could shut this entire wedding down in just a few minutes. Before the story goes any further, if stories like this give you something to think about, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read those messages more often than you might think. And now, let me tell you what really happened that day. The soft laughter still hung in the room as Lisa lowered her glass. It wasn't loud laughter, just quiet breaths, quick glances exchanged between tables. But at my age, after years working on the ocean and sitting in more tense boardrooms than I can count, I know that sound very well. It isn't joy. It's the sound of silent agreement. Agreement that my wife had just become the joke of the evening. Victoria was still standing beside the head table. She held the check in her hand, her head slightly lowered, not out of shame. I know her too well for that. When Victoria lowers her head like that, it usually means she's trying to read something slowly, one line at a time. The crystal lights above reflected softly on her silver hair. In all that luxury, she almost looked out of place. The seaside estate in Newport tonight was glowing like an old palace. Stone walls, tall windows facing the ocean, long tables covered with white linen stretching across the grand hall. I had signed a check for $500,000 to turn this place into a wedding for my son. $500,000. For many people in this room, that number is nothing. For me, it was the result of nearly 40 years working on research vessels in cold waters. I'm a marine engineer, retired a few years now. My life was never built around big parties, or the expensive suits sitting around this room tonight. I'm used to the sound of ship engines, technical drawings, long nights with nothing but ocean wind. Victoria walked beside me through all of it. We met when I was still a young engineer, and she worked in the town's small library. Even back then, I knew she read more slowly than most people. Numbers sometimes confused her, but I also knew something else. Victoria is the most patient person I've ever met. She can sit for hours just to understand one page. Not because she isn't intelligent, just because the world of letters and numbers sometimes moves too fast for her. But in 30 years, that never once made me think she was less than anyone else. Only outsiders think that way. And tonight, the outsiders had become my son's new family. I glanced over at Eric. He stood beside Lisa on the other side of the table, one hand resting lightly on his wife's back. The expensive tuxedo made him look just like the young lawyers I see on television. Confident, polished, and a little unfamiliar. Sometimes I wonder when the distance between us became so large. Eric grew up in a small house near the harbor. He used to run down the pier every time my ship returned. Back then, he was never embarrassed by his parents. But things changed when he entered law school. Then he met Lisa, and not long after that, the Sterling family stepped into his life. Mr. Sterling is the kind of man you recognize from the very first handshake. Firm, quick, and always held half a second longer than necessary. He talks a lot about investment opportunities and strategic relationships, words men like me rarely use. Mrs. Sterling prefers to observe. I caught her eyes several times tonight. They drifted over Victoria's simple dress, then paused on the way she held the menu, reading each line slowly, almost letter by letter. About an hour earlier, when the appetizers were served, Lisa leaned slightly toward Victoria. "The menu is in French," she said, just loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear. "If you'd like, I can read it for you." Victoria smiled gently. "Thank you. I just read a little slowly." Lisa smiled. Not openly cruel, just a little too polite. Half a second longer than necessary. Enough for the people nearby to understand. After that, things followed a familiar pattern. Small remarks, suggestions that sounded harmless. Maybe Victoria should let the waiter explain. These dishes can be a bit complicated. I stayed silent. Not because I didn't hear. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far it would go. And eventually, Eric stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall to thank the guests. He spoke smoothly, like a lawyer used to addressing a room. He thanked the Sterling family. He thanked their business partners. He thanked friends who had flown in from New York. When he mentioned us, his voice slowed slightly. My parents have always been very supportive, he said. Then he paused. Just 1 second, but I saw his eyes flick briefly toward Victoria. Then he added something, a line many people in the room probably didn't even notice. So tonight, my mom won't need to give a speech. We'd like to keep the program moving. A few people nodded, as if that were perfectly normal. Victoria said nothing. She simply placed her hand on the edge of the table, gripping it gently. I knew she understood exactly what that sentence meant. Eric didn't want his mother standing in front of 400 guests. He was afraid she would read too slowly, afraid she might disturb the perfect atmosphere of the evening. A little while later, Lisa returned to the table. In her hand was a folded sheet of white paper. She placed it in front of Victoria, along with a pen. I think you should write a few words of blessing, Lisa said softly, her voice so sweet it almost sounded artificial. Everyone would be very touched if you read it. Victoria looked down at the paper. Silence stretched for several seconds. I watched as she unfolded it, staring at the empty page. Lisa kept smiling, and I understood immediately what she was doing. She knew Victoria couldn't read smoothly in front of a crowd, and a blank page would make everything far worse. A small trap, laid quietly in the middle of a celebration. I remained still. The wine glass in my hand was still nearly full. At my age, a man learns an important thing. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's simply the way you wait for the right moment. Victoria still held the paper in her hand, and inside the pocket of my suit, there was something else waiting to be brought into the light. In the grand hall, the soft music from the string quartet continued to float through the air. Servers moved quietly between the tables, topping off crystal glasses with more wine. The party carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. But I noticed something else. More and more eyes were drifting toward our table. Curiosity spreads quickly at gatherings like this. Victoria set the blank paper down, then gently pushed the pen aside. I think I'll just give my blessing out loud, she said softly. Her voice is always like that. Calm, unhurried, never confrontational. Lisa tilted her head. Her smile didn't change. Oh, I think everyone would enjoy hearing you read it, she replied. But if it's difficult for you, that's fine. She said the word difficult very lightly, but loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear. Eric stood behind Lisa, his arms folded across his chest. He said nothing. He simply watched his mother with a kind of cool patience. Then Lisa stood up. She lifted her glass and tapped it gently with a small silver spoon. The clear ringing sound carried across the hall. Conversations slowly faded. 400 guests turned toward the head table. I think this is a perfect moment for a toast, Lisa said, her voice confident and clear. First, I want to thank my parents, and also my new family. A light round of applause followed. She paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. Then her eyes settled directly on Victoria. I also want to thank my mother-in-law, Lisa said. She's a very fortunate woman. A few polite smiles appeared around the room. Lisa continued. Not everyone gets to step into such a comfortable life, especially when the world of finance and numbers can be a little complicated. Some guests were beginning to understand what she meant. Soft chuckles rose from a few distant tables. Lisa took a small sip of wine. But sometimes, she continued, life needs more than luck. It also needs people who can make the right decisions. She turned toward Eric. That's why Eric and I believe some things in the family should be organized clearly, starting now. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Sterling give a very small nod from the nearby table. Lisa set her glass down. From a small purse beside her chair, she took out a thin stack of papers. Just a simple document, she said. An agreement to make managing the family funds a little easier. She placed the papers in front of Victoria. Along with the pen, of course, Lisa added gently, not everyone enjoys dealing with paperwork. But we thought Mom might feel more comfortable letting people who are used to this sort of thing handle it. Victoria looked down at the papers. She didn't touch them. Eric stepped a little closer. Mom, he said, his voice soft enough to sound like advice, but loud enough for several people nearby to hear. It's just a formality. Victoria looked up at her son. I don't quite understand it, she said slowly. Eric let out a quiet breath. You don't need to understand everything. Lisa already reviewed it. Lisa smiled again. It simply confirms that the investment decisions will be managed by us, she explained. That way everything will be more efficient. Victoria still didn't pick up the pen. Eric watched her for a few seconds longer. Then he said something that made the entire table fall silent. Mom, you should just stay home and knit, he said calmly. Numbers and assets should be handled by someone with a mind like Lisa's. A few guests at the neighboring tables shifted in their seats. Not everyone seemed comfortable hearing that, but no one spoke. Victoria remained still. I could see her hand resting on the edge of the table, her fingers tightening slightly. Lisa gently pushed the papers a little closer. You just need to sign right here, she said softly. That moment stretched longer than usual. I looked around the hall. 400 people, crystal chandeliers, soft music, and in the middle of it all, my wife was being asked to give up control of her own life, at a celebration I had paid for. I set my wine glass down. The sound of glass touching the table was very small, but Victoria looked up immediately. She looked at me. No words were needed. We have lived together for more than 40 years. One glance is enough. I stood up. My chair moved softly across the stone floor. A few nearby guests turned to look. Eric looked at me too. Dad, he said quietly, a hint of warning in his voice. There's no need to make a scene. I adjusted the cuff of my jacket. Then I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my suit. There was a folded document waiting there, not the kind Lisa had just placed in front of Victoria. This paper was thicker, heavier. I took it out and placed it on the table between us. You're right about one thing, I said slowly. Important decisions should be handled by people who truly understand them. Lisa looked at the paper with curiosity. Eric frowned. Victoria remained silent. I unfolded the document. The ceiling lights reflected off a small gold seal at the bottom corner. A few guests at the nearest tables leaned closer, trying to see. I placed the paper directly in front of Victoria. Before anyone signs anything, I said, perhaps everyone should take a look at this. Lisa's brow tightened slightly. What is that? She asked. I looked straight into her eyes. It's not the check, I said. Then I turned the paper so the entire table could see it clearly. It's a gold deposit certificate, issued in Victoria's name. And in the very next moment, the room began to fall silent in a very different way. The silence in the hall wasn't like the quiet moments earlier. This time, it spread slowly, from our table to the nearest tables, and then gradually across the entire room. Lisa leaned down to study the paper in front of Victoria. At first she kept her composure, but I saw her eyes stop at the small gold seal in the corner. That look was no longer curiosity. It was the look of someone realizing they might have been looking at the wrong thing. A gold deposit certificate, Lisa repeated. Eric leaned down as well. Being a lawyer, he reads documents faster than most people in this room. I noticed his shoulders tighten slightly as he reached the title on the page. He flipped the first page, then the second. The hall remained silent. Dad, Eric said quietly, what is this? I didn't answer right away. I pulled my chair out and slowly sat down again. Then I glanced around the room. Some guests had already half risen from their seats, trying to get a better look. This is a gold deposit account opened 30 years ago, I said. At the time, I was still working on a survey vessel in the North Atlantic. Mr. Sterling frowned. I don't believe this party needs a discussion about finances, he said, his voice a little sharp. I turned toward him. You're right, I replied calmly. But since your daughter just placed a financial document in front of my wife, I think clarity is fair. Lisa was still staring at the paper. But what does this have to do with managing the family fund? She asked. I folded my hands on the table. The family fund you just mentioned, I said, isn't in my name. Lisa looked up. Eric did too. I turned toward Victoria. She had been sitting quietly this whole time. Her eyes moved slowly across the document again, the same careful way she reads everything in life. I rested my hand on the table. 30 years ago, I continued, I transferred my largest investment into Victoria's name. A few people at nearby tables began whispering. Lisa let out a small laugh. A stiff one. You mean she holds it for you? I shook my head. No. I turned the paper slightly so the light would clearly show the seal and the line beneath it. She owns it. Eric flipped to the last page. That was where the total value of the deposit was listed, updated to the current market. I watched the color slowly change in his face. That can't be, he whispered. Lisa immediately pulled the document closer to herself. She read faster, then read it again. This number is $65 million, she asked, her voice no longer steady. I nodded. Approximately. No one laughed anymore. At the next table, Mrs. Sterling set her wine glass down a little too hard. Wait a moment, she said. I thought you were the one who owned most of the family assets. I looked at her. That's what many people assume. Another silence followed. But this one felt heavier. Lisa placed the paper down very slowly. Then she looked at Victoria, for the first time that evening, with a completely different expression. Victoria, she said, her voice noticeably softer. If there was any misunderstanding earlier, I think we can talk again. I heard a small laugh from a table behind us. Not mocking, just the natural reaction when someone realizes the direction of a situation has suddenly changed. Eric turned toward his mother. Mom, why have you never told me about this? Victoria thought for a few seconds before answering. Because you never asked. The sentence was simple. But Eric had nothing to say after that. Lisa took a deep breath. I think she said perhaps we should review that document from earlier. Maybe there's no need for a signature after all. I tilted my head slightly. You changed your mind rather quickly. Mr. Sterling straightened in his chair. I believe this is simply a misunderstanding, he said. Both our families want what's best for Eric and Lisa. I looked at him for a moment. Then I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket again. Yes, I said. Speaking of misunderstandings, I have something else to clarify. Eric looked at me. Dad, that's enough, he said. I took out my phone, not to call anyone, just to open a recording. The first sound that came from the small speaker was Lisa's voice. After the wedding, everything will be easier. Around the hall, a few guests began turning toward our table again. I placed the phone on the table and raised the volume slightly. Eric's voice came next in the recording. Dad won't agree to that, Lisa answered quickly. He doesn't have to. If Victoria is declared financially incompetent, we can request legal guardianship. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Mr. Sterling shot up from his chair. What are you doing? He demanded. I remained seated. The recording continued. A couple of doctors signing the paperwork. And it's done, Lisa's voice said from the phone. After that, Eric manages everything. No one spoke. Eric stared at the phone, as if he had just heard a stranger. Lisa wasn't smiling anymore. Victoria finally closed the certificate. Then she set it gently aside. After that, she opened her small purse. From inside, she took out a thin notebook. The leather cover was worn with age. She placed it in front of Mr. Sterling. I read slowly, Victoria said softly, but I take notes very carefully. She opened the first page. Neat handwriting filled the entire sheet. Over the past 2 years, she said, I've been purchasing some of Sterling Company's debt. Mr. Sterling leaned down to look. Then he fell silent. Victoria turned another page. Actually, she said calmly most of it. Mr. Sterling stared down at Victoria's notebook for a long time. I saw his hand resting on the edge of the table, and then slowly pulling back. The writing inside the notebook wasn't colorful. Just numbers, dates, names of loans, and intermediary companies. But for people who understand finance, those lines were more than clear enough. This can't be correct, Mr. Sterling said quietly. Victoria didn't argue. She simply turned another page. The loan from March last year, she said slowly. Sterling Hospitality Company, $7,200,000. Mr. Sterling swallowed. I remember that transaction, he said. Victoria nodded. The final buyer of that debt was a small investment fund in Boston, she said. But that fund is managed by me. A few guests began, leaving their seats, stepping closer. Curiosity at large parties is always stronger than politeness. Lisa stood beside the table, both hands gripping the edge of her wedding dress. What kind of game is this? She asked, her voice no longer calm. Victoria looked up at her. It's not a game, she said gently. Just legal transactions. I glanced around the room. Many people had stopped talking. They were watching our table like a play that had suddenly begun without warning. Eric turned toward me. Dad, he said quietly. You knew about this, I nodded. From the beginning. Eric looked at his mother. Mom, You did all of this, Victoria thought for a moment. Not quickly, she said, but carefully enough. She closed the notebook. There was no loud sound, but the gesture felt like a door being shut. Lisa stepped back, half a step. I think we should stop this, she said. This is a wedding. I stood up. Yes, I said. That's what I think too. I turned toward the musicians. They had stopped playing when the recording started. Thank you, everyone, I said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. But tonight, perhaps it should end here. Several guests exchanged glances. Mr. Sterling reacted immediately. You can't simply do that, he said. This reception I can, I replied calmly. I took a thin set of papers from my inner jacket pocket. It wasn't thick like the document Lisa had brought earlier, but it carried the signatures of two people I knew very well. Eric and Lisa. I placed the papers on the table. Before the wedding, I said you both signed a moral conduct clause in your marriage agreement. Eric frowned. I remember, he said, but that's just a standard clause. I nodded. The clause states that any public action seriously damaging the honor of one's parents activates the right to withdraw financial support. Lisa stared at the papers. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying, I replied, that clause has just been activated. A few people nearby quietly gasped. Eric straightened. You can't be serious, Dad. I'm very serious. I opened the document. The $500,000 wedding, I said. The Manhattan penthouse I transferred to you both last year, and the startup investment for Eric's company. I looked directly at my son. All of it will be reclaimed. Lisa laughed, but the sound was short. You're joking, she said. I shook my head. Just then, the large doors of the hall opened. 3 security staff stepped inside. They wore black suits and moved quietly. I had hired them earlier for this evening. Not to cause trouble, just in case. The lead guard approached our table. I'm afraid the reception has concluded, I said to him. He nodded. We'll assist the guests in leaving the premises. Lisa turned to Eric. You have to say something, she whispered urgently. Eric stood still. His eyes moved from the document to Victoria's notebook, then across the room full of guests watching. Finally, he looked at me. You're destroying everything he said. I thought for a few seconds before answering. No, I said. I'm simply closing a door that you chose to open. At the other table, Mrs. Sterling had already stood up. We'll be leaving, she said coldly. Victoria nodded politely. Thank you. Lisa didn't move. She stood in the middle of the hall, in her white wedding dress. But under the lights now, the fabric looked strangely pale. You can't do this to us, she said. I looked at her for a moment. You called my wife a fool in front of 400 people, I said. I paused. And you thought there would be no consequences. No one spoke. The musicians began packing their instruments. Guests slowly left their tables. Soft murmurs spread across the hall. A $500,000 wedding ended in silence. Eric was still standing there. I looked at him one last time. You didn't lose everything tonight, I said. Then I turned to Victoria. You just finally understood what you had already lost. The wedding ended faster than any reception I had ever seen. There were no loud arguments, no chaos. Just chairs slowly emptying, one table at a time. The musicians packed their instruments in silence. The servers cleared away half-finished glasses of wine, and the grand hall that had been glowing an hour earlier suddenly felt wide and cold. Victoria stood beside me for a long time. She said nothing as the last guests walked out. I looked down at the table. The gold certificate was still lying there, catching the light from the chandelier. Are you all right? I asked quietly. Victoria thought for a moment. Yes, she said. Then she smiled. Just a little. Actually, I feel lighter. We left the mansion late that night. The wind from the ocean moved across the old stone steps. The sound of waves against the shore was clearer now without the music or the voices of hundreds of people. I paused for a moment before stepping down the last stair. Victoria stood beside me. 30 years ago, I said, when I transferred that account into your name, I only wanted to make sure that if one day I couldn't work anymore, you would still have control of everything. Victoria looked out toward the ocean. I know, she said. I turned to her. You never asked why. Victoria gave a soft laugh. Because I trusted you. We didn't say much on the way home. 6 months later, morning on the bay was very quiet. My small boat wasn't the kind of luxury yacht many people in Newport like to show off. It was just an old wooden boat I had bought years ago, big enough for 2 people to sit, drink coffee, and watch the water. Victoria sat at the front of the boat with a notebook resting on her knees. Not the notebook about the sterling debts. This one was newer. On the cover were simple words, the Victoria Scholarship Fund. I poured more coffee into 2 metal cups. How many applications now? I asked. Victoria turned a page. 43, she said. Most of them are children who struggle with reading and writing. She paused for a moment. Some of them remind me of myself. When I was young, I handed her the cup of coffee. Then the fund already means something. After that night in Newport, we didn't sell the mansion. We simply closed it. Part of the family wealth was moved into the scholarship fund. The rest Victoria continued to manage, just as she always had. But she no longer kept it quiet. The fund did not carry my family name. Victoria didn't want that. This is the children's story, she said, not ours. The boat rocked gently with the waves. A seagull passed low over the water. Victoria looked down at the notebook once more, then closed it. Eric sent a letter, she said. I wasn't surprised. I figured he might. Victoria took an envelope from her coat pocket. It had already been opened. I haven't replied yet, she said. I didn't ask what was inside. After a while, Victoria placed the envelope on the small table between us. I think I will answer him, she said. Just not right now. I nodded. There's no rush. Victoria looked out across the water. I'm not angry with him anymore, she said. Her voice was calm. But I don't want things to go back to the way they were. I understood that. Some doors in life don't need to slam shut. They simply close. And people move forward. Victoria took a sip of coffee. There's one thing I want to tell him, she continued, that the greatest wealth in a family isn't money. I smiled quietly. I suppose you'll write that in the letter. Victoria nodded. I'll tell him. The most valuable thing parents can give their children is gratitude. The sea wind moved across the deck. The scholarship notebook lay open on the table, resting on the very first page. There was a sentence Victoria had written there in careful handwriting. For those who were once called slow, but never stopped trying. I looked at those words for a long moment. Then I looked at the woman who had sat beside me for nearly 40 years. Many people once believed Victoria was weak. Many believed she was slow. But they were wrong. And sometimes the truth doesn't need to be spoken loudly. It only needs time and a little patience. The boat drifted slowly across the quiet morning water. No music, no 400 guests. Just the ocean wind, 2 cups of coffee, and a small notebook beginning a new story. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Sometimes in life, it's easy to judge someone by appearances, by a few words, or by a passing moment. But as the story of Victoria and me has shown, a person's true worth often lives in patience, kindness, and the quiet strength they carry through the years. If this story made you pause and think about family, respect, and gratitude, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so others can hear it too. Because sometimes, a small story can remind us of the most important thing. Be kind to the people who have quietly stood beside you. Your whole life